Hey, well, good evening. At this point, I think we have, hello, Mr. George. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you were on as we were getting ready, thank you for your patience and welcome. I'm Cindy DeLancey. I'm an attorney with Holland and Hart in Cheyenne, in the Cheyenne office. And my area of focus with my practice is project development, as well as I'm the director of government affairs. Through my work at Holland and Hart, I've been so blessed to get to know Samantha Wolfe. Samantha is a partner in Denver. And the areas that of her practice is employment, labor law, immigration services, cross-border transaction, and international services. Samantha is a graduate of the Chicago Kent College of Law. She's admitted in the Colorado bar as well as the Illinois bar. And as her practice primarily focuses around immigration law and federal practice, she's able to practice anywhere in the country working on these issues. As you know, we're hearing in the news right now that immigration is really at the forefront of national politics and policy. And Samantha's practice, she's been very busy these days, really advising clients on how to navigate some of the ins and outs of working with ICE or having employees from other countries, and really just kind of helping businesses prepare and navigate through the immigration maze. So, we were kind enough to be able to do this for the stock growers, and knowing that we have a lot of international folks working with us here in Wyoming in various aspects of agriculture. So getting together to give a little bit of an update on some things happening at the federal level, as well as again addressing some questions and taking some time to work through some of the issues surrounding immigration law and policy, we felt was very timely, and we are happy to be with you all tonight and share Samantha's expertise on this topic. So I guess I will turn things over to Samantha, and we will just go ahead and just jump right in. So Samantha, why don't you lead us off?
Yeah, so good evening. I know this is the time of day when you're finally home and hopefully have your boots off. So I really appreciate you being here tonight. And what Cindy and I really wanted to do with this presentation was share practical tools that, that you guys can use to bring in qualified foreign workers when local help isn't available. So what we'll do is we'll walk through visa options that fit seasonal and long-term needs, how to stay on the right side of federal compliance rules, and what it takes to keep a good worker here permanently. And we know that your time is precious, so we'll keep it clear and focused. And we're also happy to stick around and answer questions afterwards as well. Okay, so a quick disclaimer before we dive in. This presentation is just for educational purposes and it does not constitute legal advice. So just need to say that to keep the powers that be happy. But here's where we're headed tonight. So first, we'll talk about why foreign labor matters, not just at a national level, but right here in Wyoming. You all know that finding reliable ranch help has gotten harder. We'll look at how visa programs can be part of that solution, especially when it comes to keeping operations moving during calving, fencing, branding, or haying seasons. Then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of the visa options that make sense for ranchers. We'll cover the H-2A and H-2B programs, what kind of jobs they work for, what timelines to expect, and how to avoid common pitfalls. We'll also touch on lesser known options like the TN visa, which can be a hidden gem if you're trying to hire veterinarians or ag professionals from Canada or Mexico. And from there, we'll shift to a longer view. What do you do when you find someone who's really good? Someone who you would want to keep season after season. And that's where green card strategies come in. And we'll walk you through how you can sponsor someone for a permanent residence and even show you a shortcut option that can apply to work that supports rural communities and food security, things that define what you may do every day. Then we can also talk about compliance. I know that's not the exciting part, but it is critical. We'll go over what you need to know about Form I-9s, audits, and site inspections, especially if you're using visa programs. The government doesn't always understand how ranch life works, but that won't stop them from knocking if the paperwork's not in order. And finally, we'll wrap up with some practical tips and best practices, how to plan ahead, how to keep things legal without getting buried in red tape, and how to build a steady workforce pipeline that works for your operation year after year. My goal tonight is to give you straightforward, usable information so you can spend more time focusing on your cattle and your land and less time scrambling for labor or dealing with federal headaches. So let's get into it. Okay. If there's one thing I don't need to explain to you, it's that finding good help is hard, and it's getting harder. For many Wyoming ranchers, it's not for lack of trying. You've posted the job, called around, asked your neighbors, but when the work is physically demanding, the pay can't always compete with oil and gas, and the nearest town may be 50 or more miles away. That can sometimes result in help being scarce, right? And this is a reality across the state, from the day and night cavers in Campbell County to fencing jobs in Carbon County to hay operations in Sublet. These are jobs that can't be outsourced, and they sure can't wait either. So when the work needs to get done, it needs to get done. And at the same time, younger generations are moving away from agriculture. And for those who stay, fewer seem to want to work long hours for seasonal wages, especially if it means living in bunkhouses or remote camps. And that's where immigration tools come in. So programs like H-2A for agricultural labor, H-2B for seasonal non-agricultural jobs like fencing or hospitality, and TN visas for Canadian and Mexican professionals. These offer a legal, structured way to bring in reliable workers when U.S. workers just aren't available.
Samantha, can you give us a example of how these visa programs might help Wyoming ranchers in a situation where maybe they could have made a difference for someone?
Definitely. And I've seen similar operations across the Mountain West benefit from visa-based labor, particularly during calving and branding season when it's tough to find dependable domestic help. And on the flip side, I've seen feedlot operations lose serious time and money when last minute labor shortages hit and they hadn't planned early enough to bring in H-2A or H-2B workers. So these programs take preparation, but with the right timeline, they can offer a reliable pipeline that keeps operations running smoothly. Okay, so we can move on to H-2A, the agricultural visa program. So let's start with what may be the most relevant for you, the H-2A agricultural visa. This program is tailor-made for the kind of work you do. Seasonal, labor-intensive, time-intensive ranch work that often goes unfilled. So we're talking about jobs like calving assistance during spring when you're stretched thin, fence repair or placement during the dry summer months, moving hay before the next storm rolls in, assisting with branding, herding, or shipping cattle when you need all hands on deck. And the idea behind the H-2A program is simple. If you've made a genuine effort to hire U.S. workers and come up empty, the government will let you bring in foreign labor to get the job done legally and reliably. But it's not as simple as calling someone and having them show up next week. So the H-2A process requires a few things. First, you need to recruit U.S. workers through state and national job postings. So this is not just checking a box. You have to show the Department of Labor that no qualified U.S. workers applied or were available. Second, you have to guarantee certain conditions for workers. So that includes free housing. Think a bunkhouse, trailer, or spare house on the property. Access to meals or a kitchen, even if it's very basic, and transportation to and from the job site. And that also includes the initial trip to Wyoming and the return trip when the job is done. And you also need to pay the required wage, which for 2025, that wage in Wyoming is $16.83 an hour. So the full process from working with the Department of Labor to getting the workers across the border takes around 90 to 120 days. So if you need workers by mid-April for calving, you're looking at starting the process around Christmas. Okay, so something else to consider is that when the H-2A program is done right, it can give you a steady, predictable labor force, people who return year after year and already know how your operation runs. And in a labor market like today's, that kind of consistency is worth its weight in gold, or in your case, beef, right? So. Okay.
Do you have some thoughts on maybe one thing you'd tell a rancher who's considering like the H-2A like for the first time, or is it as onerous as maybe it feels? Or talk us through a little bit about your impressions of how you've been able to help people navigate the paperwork and the process.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest misconception is that the paperwork is too overwhelming or that it's only for large scale operations. The truth is, with good guidance, it is manageable, and you can often use the same workers year after year. And I also do hear concerns about housing, but there are creative, compliant ways to meet the requirements. So you just need to think of it like a seasonal investment, and then it really does pay off. And one thing that I would tell somebody who's thinking about starting this for the first time is I think the biggest advice is start early. Usually 4 to 5 months in advance of when you need workers, and that gives you time to certify the job, recruit, and complete the visa steps without stress. Okay, so now let's turn to the H-2B visa, which is designed for seasonal work that isn't strictly agricultural, but it's still essential to running your ranch. So think of jobs like fencing teams, right? That, maybe Cindy mentioned sometimes, right, hiring a teenager right down the street for fencing, or that somebody helping with fences that moves from ranch to ranch, rebuilding miles of perimeter after a rough winter, or construction team building calving barns or bunkhouses before the cold sets in, workers helping with feedlot operations, sorting and processing cattle in fall or early winter, or irrigation support crews during high water months. What separates these jobs from H-2A work is that they aren't directly involved in agricultural production, but they're still vital to the ranching operation and tied to a season or cycle. That's the key rule for H-2B. The work must be temporary and tied to a specific season, not year-round. Now, the big catch with the H-2B is the visa cap. Unlike H-2A, which is uncapped, the federal government does limit H-2B visas to 66,000 per year, divided into two chunks, essentially. So the first is 33,000 visas for jobs starting October to March, called the first half, and then 33,000 for jobs starting April to September, the second half. And because these visas are in high demand, used by everything from landscapers in Texas to seafood processors in Alaska, they go really fast. There is actually a lottery system if demand outstrips supply, which it usually does. But we can help you improve your odds if you start early. You can begin preparing about 150 days before your start date. And the earlier you file, once the window opens, the better your chances. You need to document the seasonality of your needs. So if your feedlot work is tied to the freeze-thaw cycle, or if your labor needs spike during certain months, we would help you build that argument so it's clear to the Department of Labor. And when it's successful, that the H-2B can offer a flexible solution for ranch work that doesn't fit neatly in the agriculture bucket, but is still time sensitive and difficult to staff. And the workers that you bring in, whether from Mexico, South Africa, or elsewhere, they often come back year after year, developing a rhythm and reliability that can be hard to replace. So for Wyoming ranchers who run lean and rely on seasonal infrastructure work or livestock support roles, this visa can be a game changer.
Samantha, is the rate the same as the H-2A and some of the requirements of transportation and housing? Are they applicable in the H-2B as well?
Yes, yes. So those standards are the same for both. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a visa option that is often overlooked but can be incredibly helpful, especially in rural Wyoming communities, and that is the TN visa. This is available under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is formerly known as NAFTA. And this program is limited to people born in Canada and Mexico who are coming to the US to work in specific roles. But the good news is that veterinarians and animal scientists are on that list. So if you've ever had trouble, and I know Cindy, you've talked to me about having trouble with this, but if you've ever had trouble getting a vet to come to your ranch during calving season, or your local large animal clinic is stretched too thin, this could be your answer. So let's say you've built a good relationship with a large animal vet just across the border in Alberta. You can sponsor them under the TN program to work for you here in the US. So some of the most relevant TN occupations for ranchers and rural communities would be veterinarian, animal scientist, and even agricultural consultant. So if you're implementing new ag tech, pasture rotation systems, or data-driven feed strategies, that can be an option. And a few of the benefits of the TN visa: one, there's no cap, so you're not competing in a lottery like you are with the H-2B. Processing is so fast and straightforward, especially for Canadians. They can be approved right at the border. So I could prepare the petition and same day they could get approved. I mean, it's the fastest option I think available for immigration. And it can also be renewed indefinitely. So, you know, we can just keep renewing it for these key roles. But it is really important to note that not just any role qualifies. The individual's job title and their education and experience have to line up exactly with what's included in the USMCA profession list. So that means a vet has to have a veterinary degree, and scientists must have the relevant degree in animal science, right? You can't just call someone a consultant and hope for the best. But for operations trying to bring in expert support, whether it's for herd health, nutrition, or genetics, it can be incredibly useful and underutilized.
Samantha, on this TN visa for, these types of scientific professionals, does this visa give them the authority to conduct their professional skills in the US, or do they have to then, work with whatever state they're in to go and get like licensed in the specific jurisdiction, or does this visa give them the ability to just do their profession without worrying about local regulatory requirements on, license specific jurisdictional matters?
That is a really great question. So they will need to receive the state license as well as the regulations currently stand. That is something that you and I had talked about something similar with Senator Ogden Driscoll about trying to make things a little bit more flexible, see if we could use their Canadian license in Wyoming, but that's still ongoing. But yes, they would need to, but typically their Canadian licenses are transferable. And we can help with that as well.
So just building on that a little bit further, for example, if somebody did think about bringing a vet across from either Canada or Mexico,
Yeah.
it probably would be prudent to be working with the Wyoming Board of Veterinary Medicine in advance and getting all this done, because it takes quite a bit at the state level, knowing that the visa could be approved the same day.
Right.
The actual jurisdictional specific ability to practice would probably, eat into some of their time here waiting around for jurisdictional, processing of site specific admission for whatever they were doing, if they needed specific approvals and licensure, locally. So just a tip, I think too, that's worth mentioning, that to get ahead of that, knowing that it's not, like when they get here, if they did get approved at the border, there still might be some local bureaucracy to work through at the same time.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. They'll need to have that that licensing worked out in order to do their job as the vet. So yeah, you don't want to be paying somebody vet wages, right? And not have them be able to, do their vet work. So yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Okay, so now let's say you found a farm worker who is, or I'm sorry, you found a worker who's excellent, hardworking, dependable, and skilled, and you want to keep them longer term. That is where permanent residence or the green card process comes in. So there's a few ways to sponsor someone for a green card. One is through a labor certification, working directly with the Department of Labor, where you need to show that there are no qualified U.S. workers available for the job. And that process can take a lot of time, usually about 1.5 to 3 years. So it is a good investment if you want to retain a good employee season after season. But one really interesting thing is that if you're hiring for a job that supports rural development and food chain supply stability or critical infrastructure, then we may be able to use a shortcut called the national interest waiver. And this would allow us to skip recruitment and file directly for a green card if the worker's job helps serve that national interest. So something many of you are already doing just by feeding the country, right? So the key takeaway, if you found a good worker and want to keep them, let's plan early so you don't lose them due to visa expiration. Okay, now I want to level with you. Hiring foreign workers, just like running cattle, is not without its risks and responsibilities. You're bringing in folks through government programs, and that means the federal agencies want to make sure you're playing by the rules. But the good news is many of the requirements are things you're probably already doing. So let's start with the basics, and that is Form I-9, which is the foundation of compliance. So every single employer in the US, whether you're hiring a local hand from Casey or a welder from Mexico on an H-2B visa, has to complete what's called a Form I-9. It's used to verify that the person you're hiring is authorized to work in the US. But here's where folks start to get into trouble. The form is deceptively simple, and small errors like missing signatures, using the wrong version, not re-verifying expired documents, those can cost thousands of dollars in penalties. ICE and the Department of Labor, they do understand if something is an honest mistake, and they will, take that into account. But if they show up at your door and find that 10 of your workers have incorrect paperwork, they can fine you, up to $2,500 per violation, and it can add up fast. So there are some simple steps to stay compliant, and protect yourself and keep your focus on the ranch instead of on red tape. So a couple of tips that I always recommend to my clients are use a standardized onboarding checklist for all workers, foreign or domestic. Keep your I-9s in a separate folder from personnel files. That way, if ICE does come and ask for them, you're not handing over more than is necessary. Always track expiration dates and re-verify work authorization on time. And I think the biggest one that I'm seeing lately is don't assume contractors are someone else's problem. So if you're using contractors as, for example, a construction team, you still need to be sure that they're not misclassified, because if they're working under your control, the liability can fall on your shoulders. Some of the best run operations that I work with typically do an annual self audit just to catch any issues before the government does. Others do ask us to conduct mock audits where we come in quietly, we check the files, and we make recommendations. And that way, if there's a real inspection, the company is not scrambling, or the ranch isn't scrambling. And I know that compliance isn't an exciting part of ranching, but it's just like fixing a section of downed fence before the cattle gets out. You patch it now, or you chase problems later. The federal government is paying closer attention to agricultural employers, especially in states like Wyoming, where guest worker programs are growing. But if you get your books clean and your records in order, you can sleep easy and get back to what you do best, which is raising cattle, managing the land, and feeding the country.
So what happens, Samantha? Let's talk through this a little bit.
Yeah.
What, what are the kind of most common mistakes you see? And then can you walk us through, like, if you are audited and there's some findings, what's the first thing you should do if you're in that situation? So could you walk us through those two items?
Yeah, so I think the biggest mistake that I see is incomplete or outdated I-9 forms, because it's just so easy to overlook those when you're busy. But ICE can fine you even if the worker is 100% authorized. So I do recommend keeping I-9s well organized, and separate, and review them annually, because that is definitely one of the biggest issues that I see. And if somebody does get audited,
Is an I-9 required every year, or once your employee comes on board, you go through the I-9 process, you have that separate file, they're good for their tenure with you, or Or is
Yeah.
how frequently do we need to do I-9s?
So you need to do I-9s when the employee is hired within 3 days of their start date. If they terminate their employment and they come back later, then if it's within a year, then you can just use supplement B for the I-9 form, and you don't have to, if you don't have to complete a brand new I-9 form, but you are required to maintain them for at least 1 year after their work terminates or within 3 years of their first date of hire. So whichever is longer there.
Okay, and then what do we do if we find ourselves in an issue where the paperwork is not up to the expectations of the inspector?
So to go off on a little bit of a tangent there, it's not required that you maintain copies of all of the the documents used to verify work authorization, right? So it's not required that you maintain the green card copy that somebody provided or the driver's license, but we do recommend it because if something like this happens, right, what we would want you to do is call counsel immediately, gather all your I-9s, your payroll records, if you use visa programs, right, your recruitment materials, if you're working with immigration counsel, will have all of that documentation ready for you and prepared for a situation like this as well. So we can go through your I-9 forms and just let you know, okay, this is what you're looking at. We see, potentially here might be some suspect documents that somebody presented to you, which, some of these, if somebody presents you a fake green card, some of the fake green cards are really good and hard to spot. And, you're not required to be a document expert, right? So, but you can still get fined for it. So we'll go through that, let you know what the estimated fines may be, let you know if any employees may need to be terminated because their documents look suspect, and then we can negotiate with the officer to try to get those fines down, to try to get more time, whatever we need. And we're usually really successful with negotiating down those fines. Yeah, call us immediately or call your other counsel.
Yeah, and maybe don't say too much until you get some advice.
Yes, definitely try to keep quiet for sure. Okay, so next up, when we're thinking about best practices, we want to make sure that we're starting early, that we are getting everything, these visa processes, they take time. So knowing ahead of time what your need is going to be and planning ahead, right? Sometimes 5 months ahead of your need, that's going to be the best case scenario for you to get these workers when you need them. And we do recommend using counsel for these filings because they change so much year after year. There was recently some litigation. I'll use this as an example. When I was a baby attorney, I did my first H-2B for a truck driver or for a truck driving operation, and the Department of Labor actually ended up denying my application because they said, truck drivers aren't in one work site, so you need to get a wage for every single stop that the truck driver goes to, which is just, that's not reasonable. And I actually filed an appeal and I won my appeal. I was so excited. And the Department of Labor came back and said, we're actually not going to follow that guidance. We're still not going to allow these H-2Bs for truck drivers. Well, that was maybe 12 years ago or so. Just this year, they came out with new regulations that said that you can do it for a truck driver. So, that is such great news for that industry. But it just goes to show you that things change constantly. They change over time. So it's really important to work with counsel again, because we'll also prepare you for site visits, anything to deal with the government will help you through with that. It's also important to educate, people on your team about compliance responsibilities, because, if a Homeland Security Investigations officer comes to the ranch and requests to see some paperwork, and maybe your employee doesn't know what they're talking about, doesn't know somebody is being sponsored, they're not able to give them that paperwork, that can sometimes be an issue. So you want to have everybody organized and ready to provide the documents that are needed. And it is important to invest in long-term strategies, because that's going to be the healthiest operation, right? The one that has these smart long-term strategies. We're using the same workers year after year. Maybe we're looking into a 3-year green card process for them, and in the meantime, we're sponsoring them for a visa, right? So, just trying to figure out the best route for your specific workers. And yeah, we just really have a lot of faith in the Wyoming agriculture industry. We just really believe that it can be a guiding light for other rural Mountain West areas. So yeah, we have a lot of hope that this can be a great solution for Wyoming.
So what would be next steps, Samantha? You've given us so much information here tonight, just kind of how does somebody start thinking about organizing their immigration tools, and, what are some things that Mr. George and Jim, could think about and share with other ones of their colleagues. And I'll go ahead and open it up after you kind of tell us that, and unmute our attendees if they have any questions for you. I know you were kind enough to say you were willing to, if I could figure out how to unmute them, maybe only you have to unmute them, but why don't you tell us that, and then maybe open it up for some questions.
Okay, yeah. So I think for somebody just starting to think about utilizing immigration tools, I think it's really important to think about what part of your operation is most vulnerable to staffing shortages. So whether that's, calving or branding, right? And then schedule a short planning call. You can with me or with Cindy, right, to evaluate what really makes sense. Is there a visa type that makes sense, or is it not going to work for you? Because these are very specific situations. They may not always work. And I think it's important to get it on the calendar early, because immigration works best when it's proactive.
Really good tips there. Thank you for that. Are you able to unmute while we've got a couple minutes left, or could Rachel unmute? You just dropped down to attendees, I think, and
okay. I think.
there we go. Yep. They're both green. Do either one of you have questions for Samantha?
I believe I'm unmuted now, am I not?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you, Jim. Thank you.
Okay. I just had a couple of questions, if it's appropriate at this time, or observations, perhaps I should say, and maybe by way of a quick background for Samantha's information. I have used the H2A program, not recently, but I used it for over 60 years.
Oh, wow.
And during that period of time, brought in approximately 100 foreign workers, obtained green cards for many of them. The process was so much simpler then than it is today. There's no comparison. So,
right.
But as I listened to you, two things came to my mind: the interrelationship between H2A and the H2B. And what I'm thinking of is, on a typical ranching operation, you may be out calving, moving cattle, moving livestock in the morning, and you may be building some fence in the afternoon. And how clear is that distinction? Can an H2A worker do a certain amount of that type of work? It's like it doesn't really separate itself into two distinct positions.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think what we would want to do is really just look at a normal day for that individual, right? So if we think 50% or more of their activities are going to, put them more in the H2B category, we'd probably not want to go that route. But if, maybe 5% of their day might be spent doing, an H2B activity, right? I think that we would be safe using the H2A in that scenario.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. The other one that became apparent to me right away, and I know it's something that's evolved in more recent times, when you talk about H2A at this point, an hourly salary. And the problem that causes for people, and I've heard many tales of this, is that, and again, in a typical ranching operation, you may have days that you don't have anything to do for 4 hours in the afternoon, or maybe you are busy, but then it's calving season and you have to get up at 2 or 3 a.m. to go out to help pull a calf that's from a cow that's having a problem. How do you manage that? It's just that these positions on ranches lend themselves really to a weekly salary and monthly salary as opposed to hourly, and yet the program is demanding the hourly. And how can people address that?
Yeah, and I think and that's a really great point, and that is an issue for a lot of individuals. So I think it's important to note that there's no specific limit in immigration law on the number of hours that H-2A workers can work, but employers must guarantee at least 75% of the work hours offered in the job contract. And that's during each 12-week or shorter period. So most job offers are typically going to be full-time, 35 to 60 hours per week, depending on the nature of the work and the harvest schedule, right? But yeah, so it has to be at least 75% guaranteed. So if one day, right, you don't have all the hours, you can make that up the next day, as long as it comes out to 75% in the end. And something that is a good feature as well is that overtime is actually not required under federal law for agricultural workers unless the workers in California or Washington. So H-2A workers can work more than 40 hours per week.
Well, that's helpful. I think there's still a serious issue there because of just tracking hours. I mean, these people
Yeah.
are often out working on their own, and they may not be working more than 40 hours, or not. It's not that they're working more hours than were specified in the contract. It's that the hours are so irregular that it's almost impossible to track and say how many hours they've actually worked.
I think where Jim's going, Samantha, is that's very unpredictable.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of the point, Jim, that you just never know what's going to
Yes.
happen on the ranch that day, that things might go smooth and you're done early, or you could have, like what usually happens on my place is things never go as anticipated and they take twice as long as you think they're going to. So
Well, and that's definitely one of those issues for sure. There are some new apps that can be helpful. They have mobile time tracking apps with GPS capabilities. There's even one specifically for H2A. It's called H2A Complete. And so these tools, they track logins and log outs and generate Department of Labor compliant records, which is really cool. But that's not always an option. And sometimes, right, you may not even have service, right, to get GPS. But yeah, for bigger operations, we'll see check-in or check-out stations. you know, a daily logs or crew leaders recording hours for each employee, or a designated crew boss or field supervisor tracking workers. But that also, those methods need to be verified regularly and checked against wage statements. So it's not a perfect system, that's for sure.
Can I ask some questions?
I
Can
was
you
gonna
hear me?
say, Mr. George, you're up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the questions. This is really serious to me. Our operation, we have a beef herd. We run a lot of calves in feeder operations. We also farm, but our primary job is dairy. And we just are struggling to find competent dairy workers. We had another dairy up here by us that just went out of business about a month and a half ago. Because they could not find labor. They sold out. They're done. They're gone. And I've been trying to find how we can make this work. In fact, I called today over to Idaho. There's a company over there that procures workers. And they told me that under the H-2A program, the workers cannot touch a cow. They cannot milk a cow. They cannot inseminate a cow. They cannot be associated that way with cattle.
Mm-hmm.
So the H-2A program will not work for me.
Yeah.
I listened to your discussion about the H-2B, and you're talking about feedlot, but you're talking about driving cattle and loading them and this sort of thing. I just don't, it looks to me like the whole labor department has ganged up and said, the people that are involved in the dairy industry are non-compliant. They are there's no program. Tell me where to go. How can I do this legally?
Yeah, so for you're right, and unfortunately year-round dairy jobs aren't H-2A eligible, which really is a shame. And that's something, you know, that we may want to talk to WSGA, right, about some legislative reform that we might pursue. But if there is a seasonal spike for you, Mr. George, you know, during calving or breeding season, right, then we may be able to qualify you for that H-2B. You know, and other things that we can look at are for TNs, for Mexican or Canadian individuals, you know, we could look at technicians, scientific technicians. So those are individuals that are working underneath, you know, underneath an animal scientist. So they don't necessarily need a degree, but they would need to fit a very specific framework. So it can be really tricky, but you know, maybe we can just try to brainstorm you know, different ways that we could try to get you some relief and some help.
Well, boy, I'm just desperate. I don't know what to do here. You know,
Yeah.
you talked about the green card strategy. You talked about those that were providing a food supply chain. I wrote it down here so I could look at that too. I have no problem tracking hours because we have clock-in times for our employees. So that's very, very logical and easy for me. I pay better than those wages you've talked about. So I'm not worried about that. And I've got housing for people, but I can't be compliant. I just don't know how to make it work. What do you recommend?
Yeah, so I do think going, if we could figure out to make a way to make it work for the TN, that we could get you some Canadian and Mexican workers. So that's something that I can look into for you specifically and see how we can make that work. If you have a couple of maybe a job description that you could provide to me, I can take a look at that. You know, I'm happy to meet with you and discuss it further. And then, you know, I would say pursuing the green card, it's just going, you know, it's something that we could do. It just would result in it would take a long time, right, for you to see that return on investment.
Yeah.
Something else that we could consider is if you wanted to set up essentially a training facility for you know, for your dairy on training, you know, individuals from outside of the country. And of course, they would be working as part of that training, but they would also need to learn. We could do what's called an H3 training visa. And you know, that is something where we could start the green card process for them when they started, because it is valid for up to 18 months. So we could start the green card process for them there. So that's something that we could potentially look into as well. So yeah, there's some things that we can do, but we just have to be creative, creative and compliant, right? That can be our approach.
I think that's probably a larger discussion than we're going to be able to solve tonight. So maybe you two can get together offline here and get, you know, get your heads together to figure out that creative and compliant way to take a look at, you know, how maybe to think about this in a little greater detail.
Yeah, because we do have a big dairy farming client, so it is an industry that we're familiar with. So I'll go through and see what types of visas that we've been doing for that client, and then I can get back to you on that as well.
Can I call you next week sometime then, Samantha?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, I will do that. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Would you mind backing up to the slide on the green card strategy so I could take a picture of it, please?
Yeah, and I'm also happy to send you this presentation as well.
Oh, would
Yeah,
you just send it? Could you just send that to me? That would be very helpful.
Oh yeah,
sure.
I'll send that to you.
And we're recording this, so Jim, you can put this in your library for your other members who weren't maybe able to tune in tonight. I think you could see there's a lot of good information here that Samantha's put together, and we wanted to make that available for folks to be able to watch at their leisure.
Excellent. We deal with a lot of ranchers that are doing this very thing, the H2A program. So we've run across it multiple times. Just haven't figured out how to make it work for us. But thank you, Jim, for setting this up, and thank you, ladies, for doing this time tonight.
Yeah.
Really our pleasure. Thank you for attending. Anything else, Jim? Maybe we lost Jim, but okay.
All right. Well, Scott, I believe I have your email, so I will make sure that I send you this PowerPoint presentation, and then also find out some time that works for you next week, so we can talk about some strategies that will work for you, to try to alleviate some of that pressure for you.
Okay, I'm just curious. I don't know if you can divulge, but is it Burnett's that you're working with, that other client? Or
What
can
was
you even
that?
say? Is it Burnett's Dairy that you're working with, or can you divulge that? That might, never mind, don't answer the question. That's not fair. Okay. All right, thank you
very
so much.
All right, have a great night, everyone. Really
All right,
appreciate
thank
the
you.
opportunity. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.